So yeah, thank you again, everyone who's decided to spend your Friday evening with us this way. I want to thank the panelists, Marcy, Mariam, Robyn, for joining and sharing in their knowledge and their experience with us. So we're going to hear from our incredible panelists about Palestine, about Cuba, about their related and intertwined struggles, and we're going to talk a lot, hopefully, about the role that U.S. imperialism plays in both of these struggles and beyond. So how we're going to structure it is we're going to hear from each panelist, and then we're going to have a Q&A discussion session portion of the evening. And in that space, like, we're sharing this Friday night together, we're here in community, we're here to learn, we're here to sharpen our theory, our understanding, and we're here to struggle with some difficult concepts, like how does Cuba relate to Palestine? And so in the course of that discussion, if disagreements or debate come up, that's healthy, as long as it's done from a place of mutual respect, love for one another, and commitment and dedication to why we're here in this room today, in support of the liberation struggles of the Cuban people and the Palestinian people and people here in the United States. So before passing to our speakers, I want to just take some time to briefly introduce and frame some terms you'll hear throughout this panel discussion. So the first one is imperialism. The title of this event is Palestine, Cuba, and U.S. imperialism. Why imperialism? Why are we using precious space on our flyer to include U.S. imperialism? Why are we framing an event in this light? We're doing that because U.S.-led imperialism, as you know, against popular movements for liberation and for sovereignty, is a crucial contradiction that we see across the world right now. And so when we study and we organize for Palestine, and we study and organize for Cuba, in order to have an accurate understanding of what is happening historically and what is happening on the ground and what our tasks are, we need to understand in a framework of imperialism and U.S. imperialism to be specific. So to truly define what imperialism is, this panel would have to probably be a 3 or 4 week course, which maybe panelists would want to do that in the future. We'll see if we can organize that. But I want to just simply propose like a simple definition, a simple description. So imperialism, again, very simply, is a stage of capitalism. It's an organic development of the capitalist system and is an exceptionally violent and aggressive stage of capitalism, right? So we see as capitalism experiences these periodic crises, which we all know too well, with recessions, depressions, businesses will fail, and then big corporations will eat the small ones, and monopolies start to develop and dominate the economies of countries. And then as those monopolies squeeze the profits from the working class of their own countries, they also start to seek increased profits abroad. So they start investing and they start dominating and exploiting working class people in other countries, expanding into new markets. So historically, imperialism has relied on direct colonization to dominate colonized countries and to steal their land, their resources, and their labor. And what we've seen historically is the problem with that for imperialists, for capitalists, is that direct colonization leads to national liberation movements. It leads to revolutions, and that sort of naked aggression can lead to national liberation, right? Because we know that where there's oppression, where there is resistance, and there's people who are fighting to establish their humanity, who are fighting to establish and defend their sovereignty as well. So after World War II, when national liberation movements had swept the globe, imperialists needed to pivot their strategy, having been forced out of this model of direct colonization in some and many cases. So instead, and the US did pioneered this, imperialists used like intelligence agencies, corporate media monopolies, national or international institutions, and militaries to install and control puppet governments within different nations that were nominally independent. We talk about like flag independence versus true like national liberation, right? So that era has been termed neocolonialism. And what I want to just briefly mention before I pass it and we continue this discussion with our panelists is an article that came out for a long essay a couple months ago. And it's by the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. If you all know Vijay Prashad, he's the director at the Tricontinental. And if you don't know Vijay Prashad, get to know him. No. He's an incredible scholar. He's brilliant, he's very wise, very principled, and he does a lot of different writing, different speaking, different courses. So I'm happy to recommend things. But this piece it's titled Hyper-Imperialism, a dangerous decadent new stage. And in it, what the Tricontinental Institute and what Vijay are proposing is that we are now kind of in a new era of imperialism, one that they've termed hyper-imperialism, where it's the US, it's not an empire at the peak of its power anymore, but instead it's an empire of decreasing power. And with that, it's more violent, it's more kinetic, more spasmodic in the way that it throws violence and relies on its military. So one of the reasons to read Tricontinental is they're incredible writers. So I just want to read a quick quote. They say, "This is not the full-blooded march across the globe that the Cold War initiated, fought in proxy battles that were followed by economic imperialism through the World Bank and other development institutions. Instead, it is the imperialism of a drowning billionaire who firmly believes he ought to be back on his yacht." And so they talk about that this hegemony of domination gets lost in three different arenas, three different phases. One of them is in production, and then finance, and then losing dominance militarily. And so they propose that the US has lost production hegemony. They're no longer the manufacturing hub of the world in the United States. We see that's moved to the global south through outsourcing and through the rise of mainly China. They're losing financial hegemony, and then all that leaves them for the only strong muscle that the US and its allies can flex is militarily. And so that we're starting to see that more now, not that we haven't seen it in the past, and that the fear is that we're going to continue to see that increasingly now, and that these sort of multinational, international institutions that the US is using in order to wield its imperial power, they tend to be military alliances. So now we see NATO plus, AUKUS, like choose 4 imperialist countries, and there probably is an acronym for what their specific military alliance is together, right? And it's all led by the United States. So we'll talk today a little bit more. We'll hear about some of the like hyper-imperialist or imperialist tactics that are used and wielded against the people of Palestine, the people of Cuba. And I just want to say that, like, what happens is when by oppressing 2 different peoples in 2 different nations, imperialism sets the stage for the solidarity of those peoples, right? And it creates its own undoers. So it's our job to see those connections, which is hopefully what we'll be doing tonight, to expose them and then to act accordingly and to resist the particular but similar and related forms of oppression and exploitation that happens across the world. So with that, I just want to also briefly say these struggles are national, they're particular. Like when we say pre-Palestine, when we say from the river to the sea, it's the territory of Palestine we're talking about, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, right? But these struggles are also international because they're all connected by US imperialism. So each struggle is both particular, it's local, it's territorial, but it's also international. So that's why we say pre-Palestine, we're also talking about freeing Cuba from US imperialism. We're talking about freeing the Philippines. We're talking about freeing and uniting Korea. We're talking about freeing the Sahel region and so many other nations across the continent of Africa, freeing them from US imperialism. So with that, I hope this lays the groundwork of why we believe this event is important. I know parts of that might have been a little bit dense, but I'm sure through the course of this panel, will start to pull on some of those threads. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Mariam El-Khatib. She's a Palestinian American Muslim who was born and raised in Minnesota. An undergrad who's part of Students for Justice in Palestine, where she served as president and helped pass divestment on campus. Very relevant now. She is currently a volunteer and advisor to the Minnesota chapter of American Muslims for Palestine, AMP. Mariam is passionate about educating her community on Palestine and draws from her own experience living under Israeli occupation. So let's have a round of applause for Mariam.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I greet you with the Islamic greeting of peace. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for all the organizers. I'm incredibly grateful to be here. And thank you for the introduction. I think I speak at a lot of events where they don't provide a really good grounding. So that was very helpful. I appreciate it. So I'm going to speak about obviously the Palestine and as it relates to U.S. imperialism in Israel. And I'll start by reading a quote from Joe Biden from 1986. Joe Biden said, and I see some of you smiling, I think you already know what I'm going to say. He said, were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region. I feel like I can end my talk here like that. But I'm sure you don't bring me to, let's say, one sentence, so we'll elaborate on that. So the U.S.-Israel bond has always been, and still is, about American imperial interests in the region. It's not out of love for the Jewish people. It's out of commitment to U.S. interests in the region. And the U.S. was the first country to recognize Israel as an independent state on May 14, 1948, when President Harry Truman issued a statement of recognition following Israel's proclamation of independence on the same day. And since then, Israel has long enjoyed ironclad commitment, as Joe Biden likes to call it, regardless of which party was in power and who was the president. So Israel has always been an issue that Democrats and Republicans have agreed on. Ultimately, Israel is an extension of U.S. empire. It allows the U.S. to have a presence in a key region, the Middle East, where there is access to resources that the U.S. wants. It allows it to have influence on regimes in the region, like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, that help the U.S. help Israel continue its occupation of the Palestinian people. I went to the website of the U.S. Embassy in Israel to see how they talk about each other. And after the first opening paragraph where they talk about Harry Truman recognizing, or it being the first to recognize Israel as a state, they say, this is the U.S. Embassy in Israel talking, since then, Israel has become and remains America's most reliable partner in the Middle East. Israel and the United States are bound closely by historic and cultural ties, as well as by mutual interests. The U.S.-Israel bilateral relationship is strong, anchored by over $3 billion in foreign military financing annually. In addition to financial support, the U.S. participates in a high level of exchange with Israel to include joint military exercises, military research, and weapons development. That's literally the second paragraph. Like that is the definition of that's what they choose to highlight in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And following the definition and the context that Simon gave us about imperialism, weaponry, weapons, war. I mean, this is what they agree on. This is this is the US interest. This is why the US cares about maintaining Israeli occupation of the Palestinian people. So how does the US protect interests? How does the US, support Israel and this imperialist project? Obviously, the easy one, I think everybody knows, is financially supporting. We all know the US gives Israel a crap ton of money. They're the biggest recipient of foreign aid. They give them $3.8 billion annually. And just last week, or in April, end of April, the House passed $26 billion in additional foreign military aid. It does include humanitarian aid, but it's like very small compared to how much is going to Israel. The US not only gives like dollars to Israel, but also provides them with weapons. I'm sure many of you have seen images from Gaza of weapons that say made in the US. We also see the US providing Israel with political support on the world stage. The US, proudly claims itself as Israel's biggest ally, and they use their veto power. Over the past 5 decades, the US has vetoed at least 53 UN Security Council resolutions that are critical of Israel and that were intended to hold Israel accountable for its actions. And just recently, again, I'm sure all of you have seen this, the US has vetoed 3 times against a ceasefire that would save the lives of thousands and thousands of people in Gaza. The other way that the US helps Israel is through the stifling of free speech and advocacy for Palestine. We know that there is anti-BDS laws, so boycott, divestment, sanctions. There's over 30 states that have laws that criminalize and punish people for boycotting Israel, which is so ironic, right? In the US, like, you can boycott anything. You can boycott a state. You can boycott, you can boycott anything. We celebrate boycotts in American history, and yet you can be punished boycotting a foreign entity. We also see the crackdown on US campus protests, and I want to take this moment to acknowledge what's been happening at the University of Minnesota. Absolutely incredible. They had an encampment up, and we've seen in other campuses the extremely aggressive response that these students have been met with administrations calling the police on their own students. And it's not just, individuals within these administrations or, these administrations acting on their own accord. Even Joe Biden himself has spoken out against these protests and talking about how we have to maintain peace. We also, I think one way that the US maintains, or supports Israel and is looking to protect its imperial interest is through supporting a 2-state solution. I don't think anyone supports a 2-state solution except the US. Like, that's actually a joke. Like, I always joke, like, we Palestinians and Zionists actually agree on one thing, it's 1 state, right? It's only the US that supports the 2-state solution. And it's not because they actually believe in it, right? They also don't believe in it, but they use it as a facade to cripple meaningful action towards justice and a free Palestine. While, they continue to support Israel, which is moving further and further away from ever allowing a free Palestine. We also have intelligence sharing, and there's a lot to be said here, but this is not a secret. The US talks about how they share intelligence with Israel. This could be strategic, so they can talk, talk about, for example, what's Iran's goals in the region, or it could be tactical, where they literally will provide information about the whereabouts of certain individuals so that Israel can go target them and kill them. And much like arms transfer, the US government must undergo a legal review before sharing intelligence with another country. But obviously, we know that, there's been multiple reports that show that Israel has been targeting civilians. And so the fact that the US is providing that intelligence for Israel incriminates the US in that they are providing the intelligence that allows Israel to kill civilians. We also see that US targeting of Palestinians and Palestinian activists here in the US. I'll mention 2 cases, the Holy Land Foundation. So this was a charity, it was the largest Muslim charity in the US, and it was led by Palestinians who did work by providing, humanitarian aid to Palestinians abroad. And in the wake of 9/11, the US wanted to flex its muscle and show that it's cracking down on terrorism. So they went after the Holy Land Foundation and they accused it of terrorism. And basically their argument, for those who don't know, was because the Holy Land Foundation was providing essentially food and resources to the orphans and the families, they were freeing up terrorists' money from providing those funds to the families in Palestine. They used secret evidence and secret witnesses that to this day that we don't know who they are, and they put 5 of the best men from our community in jail 3 of them are still serving, 2 of them are serving 65-year sentences. And then we also have local activists here whose houses were raided by the FBI because of their work, including their work on Palestine, right? So this crackdown on the work for Palestine here is one way that Israel seeks to intimidate and scare people from engaging in criticism and work that's meant to bring down Israeli occupation and help maintain Israeli interests in the region. And then I'll share one small example. Have you all heard about the Israeli soldier that was fighting in Gaza on a tourist visa? Oh. No, look it up. This video just came up 2 weeks ago. He's Jewish American, and he was visiting Israel. He was on a tourist visa, and he basically went and he just asked if he could join, the army, and he was able. And I don't know if he was previously, like, he has dual citizenship. I forget the details, but basically he was there on a tourist visa after October 7th, and he, essentially enlisted. And he was serving, and then he kept asking if he could be deployed to Gaza, and he was deployed to Gaza. And he did all of this on a tourist visa, which is insane, right? Like that's, again, that's how the US allows its own, citizens to go fight other wars, even when it's, on a tourist visa. But for, students who are trying to set up an encampment on campus, they're trying to shut that down and punish it and criminalize it. And again, I think that shows how, aggressive the US is and will go, and to the extent that it will go to protect its interests in the region. In October, Joe Biden repeated his same statement in 1986. If they were not in Israel, we'd have to invent one. But I feel, the difference this time is that it comes in a much different context, a time in which more and more people, and specifically Americans, are coming to understand the reality of what Israel is, and that Israel is not a democracy in the Middle East, and that Israel is an apartheid, genocide, ethno-state. And I think with that, not just learning about Israel, but I think more Americans are coming to terms with America and what America is and what America stands for, the hypocrisy that America is. And so, although the situation is difficult, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we are getting closer to not only the end of Israeli occupation and the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea, but also the end of US imperialism and its ugly impact and flaws and aggression that it deploys in all over the world. So thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Our next speaker is going to touch a little bit on Cuba, a lot of it on Cuba. She is Marcy Shapiro. She's a longtime Cuba solidarity activist. In recent years, she has done this as a member of SCOTA, the Solidarity Committee on the Americas. And she's also done Cuba solidarity activism through national groups, such as the National Network on Cuba. She has traveled to Cuba 12 times, both through solidarity delegations and individually, and also was my tour guide, more or less, in Cuba, both political and logistically a couple years ago. So with that, let's give a warm round of applause for Marcy.
Is that working? Okay. Notes and okay. I'm gonna start by just talking about what happened 2 days ago. 2 days ago was May Day, International Workers' Day, and it is one of the most important holidays in Cuba. And 200,000 people marched in Havana, and lots of people in other cities. There were lots of people from other countries who came to join in this march. The day after May Day, there was a solidarity meeting focused on anti-imperialism led by the president of Cuba. And it focused on ending the blockade, ending the siege in Palestine, and to end colonialism and imperialism. And it was attended by a lot of union people. there's a lot of focus on labor in this particular event, but also solidarity, people who are part of organizations that are related to Cuba. So the question that you might ask is, so why do so many people come to Cuba? For May Day and for solidarity, and why would I travel to Cuba for so many times unless I'm just kind of a little weird? Which I probably am anyway, and for me, going to Cuba is about kind of having a sense of hope. A lot of, I was thinking about what you were talking about, what the US does with imperialism and how we treat our people here. And one of the things that I always feel like when I go to Cuba is that I have a sense that there's another way to live. And some of the things that I find when I'm going to Cuba is, like I said, hope, safety, because it's a country that focuses on people and on making sure that people have good lives. And it has high social standards. For me, coming from the US, we focus on individuals and each of us is responsible for our own situation. In Cuba, it isn't that people don't have their own individual things that, they bring to their lives, but for me, in Cuba, there's a sense of solidarity and joining together to build a country that meets everyone's needs. Cuba is not perfect. I'm starting out by saying all this positive things. Cuba is not perfect, but there's a movement in Cuba from the revolution, which was in 1959, until today, to develop their thinking, to develop their framework for who they are as a nation, and that is focused on people, as unlike the US, where I think our focus is on dollars and on who's got the money. And Cuba, even though the revolution was in 1959, they're still working on building a new society, and I'll talk about a couple things later on how they're doing that. Cuba, before the revolution in 1959, was a colony controlled by the US. I would say it was a colony, even though it wasn't called a colony of the US. It basically was, its economy was controlled by the US. The last president before the revolution was Batista, who was certainly very tied to the US. And it was a country filled with corruption, oppression, a huge amount of very, very poor people, and massive differences between the rich and the poor. So over a period of time before 1959, there was organizing both in cities and in rural areas. It was underground, a lot of it, to start to think about it and develop a revolution and to change the government. And so in 1959, the revolution came. And for people in Cuba, there was a massive excitement about the revolution happening, and except for a lot of rich people who got on their boats and got on their planes and went to Miami. And so you will see in the United States kind of the effect in Miami and in Florida and also in New Jersey and in Las Vegas, that the Cubans that went there basically really hate the government of Cuba, as I'm sure you all know. And they have done everything they could from 1959 to destroy the government in Cuba while getting really rich. So a lot of the people who went to Miami were people who were in the gambling and prostitution and other illegal trades, drug trafficking, and they continued to do it when they came to the United States. Not all Cubans, I'm not talking about all Cubans, but the leadership in the Cuban community in the US came out of that grounding of corruption and crime. So from the beginning, the US was really opposed to the revolution. They were opposed in particularly to Fidel Castro. They had a real fixation on him, and they were opposed to the new government. And so you could see this really early because Fidel traveled to the US soon after the revolution. He went up sort of the East Coast and went to different cities, and he went to Washington DC, and he went to meet with the government, and President Eisenhower, who was the president then, refused to see him. Although Richard Nixon, the vice president, did see him, which was very odd to me. But anyway, he really had a difficult time even kind of getting a grounding with the West from the very beginning. And amongst the people in the various cities that he moved to in the US, you know, like New York, and he went to Boston, I can't even remember the cities, but they were East Coast cities. And people were cheering him, they were thrilled to see him. I think people understood that this was going to be a new day for Cuba, and maybe they were hoping it would be a new day for the US too. And so there was a lot of excitement about him, but the US made sure after that that wouldn't happen anymore. So began from 1960, so we're talking 1 year after the revolution, the US instigated an embargo, or what most of us who are in solidarity would call it the blockade, because it is really a blockade. It's not just a basic embargo. That was the beginning of the longest and one of the most severe set of sanctions for a country in the world. It is the longest amount of sanctions. No country has had sanctions that long. It's 64 years of sanctions, and no, there is not any country that their sanctions have lasted that long. And in 1960, the Mallory memo was put out by the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and it was released. And I think the words that he had really say what the purpose of the sanctions were. He said, the purpose of sanctions is denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. And basically in the 64 years, the Mallory memo could have been written today. It's the current philosophy towards Cuba. And so in those 64 years, the damage to the Cuban economy has been $1.3 trillion. Now, if you think about the size of Cuba, $1.3 trillion is a mammoth amount of money for a country that small. You know, Cuba's, you know, the US in many ways compares Cuba like it's an equal, but Cuba's a small country, you know, and it's not, I think there's like 11 or 12 million people there. And so we're not talking about an equivalent country to the US. And so $1.3 trillion is incredible, and it's been so destructive to their economy. So I'm going to go back to why I go to Cuba. So I go, and I think a lot of other people go, is to see a country where there are successes and achievements of what my values are. And so, for example, just like life expectancy in Cuba. You know, even though Cuba's a small country and it doesn't have the resources of the US, in general, for most years, its life expectancy is equal or a little bit better than the US. And for infant mortality, it's usually better than the US. So, and Cuba has lots of things that it has done over the years that has made it into a country that is really a good place to live, but it's also a difficult place to live because of the sanctions by the US. The sanctions cause so much hardship for people in Cuba. You know, the US is like, when Fidel was alive, they thought, well, this is getting Fidel, you know, but it wasn't. I'm sure he was really not happy about it for the Cuban people, but all the people in Cuba are affected by these sanctions. And so I think Cuba, in spite of all these sanctions and in spite of all the terrible things that the US has done to it, has been able to develop some things that we in the US aren't able to develop. Their healthcare system is incredible. They have grassroots healthcare. You know, you live on, you know, within a block or two of your doctor, your family doctor. Cuba has more physicians per person than any country in the world. The most doctors, you know, are really so committed to really help the healthcare, and they're really experimental. And Cuba has done a lot of research and has created things that, you know, the US hasn't. You know, they have, for example, a vaccine for people who have lung cancer, something we don't have here. They have a lot of things that they're in the process of inventing. When COVID came, they, within a very quick time, invented 3 different vaccines for COVID, and the country was pretty close to being 100% vaccinated, unlike here. And their rate of, you know, death and people being ill was so much, percentage-wise, was so much lower than here. And another thing that Cuba has done is to be international about their use of their healthcare system. So they have a medical school that trains doctors from around the world, from mostly countries that don't have the resources. Palestine is one of the places that they have a lot of Palestinians that have been trained at it's called the Latin America School of Medicine, and they have been trained there to be doctors. It's free to anybody who goes. People from the US get trained there, who are gonna go back to a poor community and serve people in those communities. And the other thing that Cuba has done is to establish the Henry Reeve Brigade, which was originally established to help the US when Katrina happened. They had a bunch of people who doctors who said they volunteered to do it. They were all set to go. They had backpacks with all the medicines in them. And George W. Bush said, no, we don't want those. It was free. It was a volunteer thing. And so they decided to use that kind of initiative to help other countries who are in some kind of a crisis, if they're having a hurricane or an earthquake and they need health care. And so the Henry Reeve Brigade has many Cuban doctors in it, and they go to different countries to help people. And one of the things that this is like an example of what the US does. So they say that the doctors who go are basically trafficked by Cuba to, because they get some extra money to go to another country to work, which is not real surprising. But they say that this is trafficking by Cuba of the doctors, and that no country should accept them when they come to their country. So anyway, another thing that Cuba has done over the years is to provide really excellent education, free all the way through college, and everybody gets educated in Cuba. I think one of the things for people who go to Cuba and you start talking to people on the street, it's kind of like, oh my God, these are some really well-educated people, and it might not be people, might be somebody you see in a store, you know, your clerk or something in a store, but there's a way that Cuba has used their education to really make sure that people are thinking and sophisticated and know about the world. And so I can remember having conversations with people on the street, and they, not only do I ask them about the US, but they know about other countries and everything that's kind of going on in other countries. And I'm kind of embarrassed that I don't know as much. So I think they have a really good educational system, and particularly in the area of healthcare and also in music. They have, as I'm sure you all know, there's incredible Cuban music, but it's not just, you know, salsa, it's also classical music. And so they have just excellent music care. And then the other thing that Cuba did right after the revolution was to have the literacy brigades, where, you know, because they had a really high level of illiteracy. And so they took kids who volunteered and their parents were okay with it. And they went out, particularly out in the countryside, and trained people how to read. And so Cuba now has a literacy rate probably close to 100%. You know, the people who can't read are for some, you know, reason, like a health, you know, some disease that they might have or something. So, and the literacy campaign is really revered in Cuba as an important thing that they did. And they train other countries on how to do it. So a lot of the Latin, Central American countries have been trained on how to train their people to be literate, and they will have literacy brigades, and Cuba has sent people there. And so it's another thing. So anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is Cuba's done a lot of things. A small country with very little money that's been squashed by the United States financially, and yet they are really focused on helping their people and helping the people of the world. So I want to talk about two campaigns that really early on after the revolution, they had a campaign to end racism. And so, they would say that it's partly successful and not totally successful. And because I think they keep learning about how they can deal with racism within the country. But I think to have a country have a whole national campaign against racism is amazing. And the other thing is they did is this year, it's not this year, it's last year, they passed the family code, which is a new code that had all Cubans involved in discussing, which is how they're going to conduct families within Cuba, so that all people are equal within Cuba. They have marriage amongst all kinds of partners. They're able to have they kind of work on supporting families so that they're strong and healthy. I have a friend who's actually here now who was really enamored with the fact that they were really supportive in the family code to do helping grandparents. Because in the US, if you're a grandparent, you don't really have many legal rights. And in Cuba, this gave people legal rights. So the family code was another initiative. So I could kind of keep going on and on. There's lots of things in Cuba, but I'm not gonna do that. So what I'm trying to say about all this, what Cuba has, it doesn't have the kind of money resources and other kinds of resources, but it has human capital, and it really encourages people to use their who they are to help the country and to I think the doctors are a really good example of that, to really make a good healthcare system. In Cuba, basic needs are met, and it's, you know, when I said there was safety, I think there's safety because people's needs are met, but there's also safety on the streets. I mean, you don't really see the kind of violence that we see here. Cuba, I got 2 minutes, okay, and I'm getting towards the real important part, so.
All right, 3.
Okay, so I walked around on the streets in Havana myself at night and I felt okay. But the reason is because Cuba has block clubs. And so people know everybody who's around, and if somebody doesn't belong, they take care of them. They're called communities for the defense of the revolution. And they're more than block clubs. They provide kind of assistance to people in their neighborhood in terms of making sure that they're taking care of their health, you know, taking care of other things in their lives that need to be done. So why does the US hate this? Does anybody guess? Because like I said, it's focused on people. And what the US has done is to develop a long and intense sanctions regime to get rid of Cuba, its government, to get it back as basically to get it back as a puppet of the US. I mean, because the US made so much money off of Cuba before the revolution. And so here are some of the things that the US did, some of which probably they do through Israel and Palestine. So they work to impoverish the island. They work on destabilization. They've invaded the Bay of Pigs was one of the first times they invaded the island to try to really get as an act of war, basically. They drop bomb in, you know, one of the things in Cuba is tourism is one of the main ways that they make money. So they had a whole campaign of having bombs in hotels. And I don't know if any of you've heard of the Cuban 5, but Cubans went to Miami to find out about what their plans were for, particularly for dropping bombs, but other things that they were going to do, that the Miami right wing were going to do in Cuba. But the whole thing of trying to destroy the tourist economy, and Trump recently when he was president, said that 600 hotels in Cuba people from the US could not be going to, because they were run by the Cuban military. The Cuban military is more of a management organization, so they were, you know, they managed these hotels, and that was one of the ways. So the US calls Cuba a terrorist state? And here's a couple reasons why I think it's a terrorist state. It's because this is recent things. One, because Assad Shakur is living there and they want her back. And the government of New Jersey in particular wants her back. The other thing is that Colombia asked Cuba to do some negotiations for them. And so what the US calls a terrorist group that was, a lot of them were living in Cuba while this negotiation was going on. So therefore, Cuba was a terrorist state. So what that did was Cuba, the US put Cuba on the US list of state sponsors of terrorists. They had been on before under George W. Bush, and then Obama took them off during his effort at normalization, and then Trump put them back on and with a vengeance and made it much worse. And so you will see back there, we have some handouts about the state sponsors of terrorists, and there are things that you can do to write to your Congress people and President Biden to take Cuba off. It only requires President Biden to sign an executive order, but he won't. And I think it was yesterday or the day before, somebody in the Office of the Secretary of State said Cuba will never be taken off the state sponsors of terrorism. So what this does is it prevents financial institutions from being able to deal with Cuba because they're called a terrorist, which then blocks medical supplies, food, other kinds of transactions that Cuba needs. They can't get fuel. There's just no sector free from the effects of the state sponsors of terrorism list that Cuba is on. So this is it's really been so destructive in the last year since Trump put them back on the list. And basically people are in some ways the language that is used about Palestine is to strangle people and to starve them. And so this is part of the purpose, and I'm almost done. And so what I want to say is that the great majority of people in Cuba stand behind its socialist project. But there is world support for Cuba. And it seems to be that the United States and Israel are the only ones that don't support Cuba. And there have been for 29 years a vote at the UN saying that Cuba should no longer have an embargo. And the only two votes in the last few years for the maintenance of the embargo is the US and Israel. And this is where, in a way, the two countries are tied together. So so there is a solidarity movement all over the world, and it's really just cruel that the US continues to do this when there's so much world support for Cuba. And so many countries have had the benefit, like Italy has had the benefit of Cuban doctors during the pandemic. So it's really important for this to change. So I will talk later about the cardiac pacemakers because my time is up.
And our last panelist of the evening is Robyn Harbison. Robyn is a first generation Wow. Sorry about that. For everyone's weight. First generation Cuban American abortion rights activists who've been living and organizing in Minneapolis for 4 years. Originally from Chicago and raised on the principles of unionism with their Chicago Teachers Union member father, Robyn is the new director of WHAM. They organized with the University of Minnesota chapter of Students for Democratic Society during their time as a student at the university from 2021 to 2023. During the late summer of 2022, they helped form the Minnesota Abortion Action Coalition with various community organizations such as SDS and WHAM in response to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. MANAC officially became a committee in February 2023, and Robyn has been a full-time member since this change and has cemented their presence and skills within the community as a result. So thank you, Robyn. And would you like mic stand or no mic stand?
Okay, I kind of talk loud without a mic, so I'm not sure if I should lead a chant. Yeah. From the river to the sea. From the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. Palestine will be free. From the sea to the river. From the sea to the river. Palestine will live forever. Palestine will live forever. Thank you. Have to put a lot of time in there. So, yeah, my name's Robyn. You just learned that. I am gonna talk really briefly about like my personal connection to Cuba and the island with my ancestry. I have some receipts for historical solidarity that Cuba has had with Palestine, and it is definitely not like a complete upward positive, streak. There's some like oscillating gaps that we'll talk about, and the gaps in research that I know for a fact are probably a result of US imperialism and the things that we can and can't access with our computers in the US, and then a little bit about what Cuba is up to now and what people on the ground in Cuba are talking about. So I am first generation Cuban. When I am going to name drop like my grandparents and all of that, I'm like only talking about like my mother's side for context. So the embargo, of course, had a very like direct impact on my family. We were all, my mother's side, both my grandparents, my grandfather has lived there his whole life. He was born and raised in Havana. He still lives there in the neighborhood of Vedado. He just turned 82 a couple months ago. Yeah, I'm so happy he's still, he's very present in his politics and stuff, and we talk about this more often than we used to, for sure. And my grandmother was also born and raised in Havana, but she left the state, Cuba in 2003 to take care of my sister and I when we were toddlers. And my mom lived there from when she was born in 71 until 99 to marry my father. So I just wanted to touch briefly, I guess, about the immigration experience that Cuban Americans, first or second or third generation, that's all like a very different experience based on like who left on boats when, basically. But anyone who is leaving the Cuban government, as far as I'm concerned, from when the blockade started 64 years ago to the present day, it's a lot easier to like flee Cuba because you can just say like, oh, I hate it here, I hate communism, and then they're like, oh my god, we love people that hate communism, you want to live here? So it's like, it's a very, very different situation compared to the rest of Latin America and how immigration is treated on that end of things, because it's like a gentle transition is how I put it, of kind of like making yourself American and not thinking very much about any other consequences of your leaving. It's actually like a tradition, maybe not so much now, but back when my mom left for sure, right after this would be 8 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, or 9, 10. But she was leaving Cuba, like from the Jose Marti airport in Havana, and people like will boo people who are leaving Havana to go to the States because it's like kind of obvious, and they like called them traitors and stuff. So she had that experience, but she like couldn't really like handle, you know, the toll of like the sanctions and like food shortages when she was my age during that time. So she left for a lot of reasons. She's never wanted to stay. So like I was raised on this mindset of like, this is a poor, sad country to be from, and it's good that we're here now, pretty much attitude, as opposed to what my grandfather like really thinks, that he's a big fan of the government and he's stayed there for as long as he had, and like has been dedicated to his community through being an arts teacher, but also just like being a community member and teaching the children how to paint and sculpt and draw simply because he wants to, and he loves educating people and connecting with who he is surrounded by. And he sees like the you know, the socialist project as like a symbol of hope of like what this world could be, right? But I was raised on the other side of the equation of like, this is like too hard to deal with and nothing is ever going to change in Cuba. I was told that a lot growing up, that it's just like, oh, well, it's just Castro's friends, like, they have elections, but it's just Castro's friends and it's never gonna change and they're never gonna be free. But what does like freedom mean, especially like living here, like just the comparison and contrast is completely like 180. So just like a brief some history I found through like research about how Cuba is related to Palestine before the revolution. Right when the partition vote on like mandatory Palestine, when essentially Israel divided Palestine for their interest and the US interest in the region. Cuba was one of the few countries that voted against this resolution in 1947. And quote, the reason for this was because they could not be a party to the coercion of the majority in Palestine, but they were pressured to vote yes. And shortly after the revolution, which was January 1st, 1959, Che Guevara was one of many liberation fighters during the Cuban Revolution, visited Gaza in 1959. And this is something that Simon and Marcy were teaching me about, so I was like, I need the receipts for all of this. And quote from some of my sources from Palestinian Land Society, Che Guevara's visit to Gaza in 1959 was the first sign of transforming the Zionist colonization of Palestine from a regional conflict to a global struggle against colonialism. And a lot of the attention came through this visit, partially because of the then president of Egypt, Nasser, was a recognized leader of this group of nations called the Non-Aligned Movement. I still have to do some more digging about that, but it was basically this group of like nations that were not really on the imperialist side of things, and they had their own summits and everything in the late 50s and 60s. And something that Che said during his visit as well, and he got to meet lots of leaders in Gaza, lots of you know, government officials from like Qasem El-Farah, who is the secretary of Khan Yunis municipality, and Abdullah Abu Seta, who is the leader of the Fayadin, which is what they called the resistant movement at the time, and the leader of the Southern Front in the Arab Revolt of 1936, which is when that postcard was made, actually, that's the date on it. But Che said during his visit, there was no way but resistance to occupation. He admitted that their case was complex because the new Jewish settlers occupied their homes, but the right must eventually be restored, as in the right to the land, to be able to live in their homelands, right? And he offered to supply arms and training, but Castro wanted this aid to be coordinated through the Egyptian president Nasser. And during his like tours of refugee camps, Guevara said to the people who are experiencing, you know, poverty and obviously from occupation and stuff, it's pretty intense like way he directed it, but I know it's for a good reason. And you know, he said we have worst case of poverty. It's like, okay, you don't need to compare and contrast, but yeah. You should show me what you have done to liberate your country. Where are the training camps? Where are the factories to manufacture arms? Where are people's mobilization centers? So even if it sounds like a little harsh, it's like it's very much like trying to move people towards like liberation and for defending themselves, because Palestinians have a right to do that under international law, and that's been known by Cubans who have been in leadership since the beginning. And then during the 6-Day War in 1967, there was some I guess oscillation of like their stance on Palestine, because they're like kind of unofficial friends with like the PLO and other groups like the PFLP, which is a Marxist-Leninist party that's still active in Palestine, and they have a lot of leadership still present there. But after this war, in June 1967, Cuba and Romania were the only socialist countries to not break diplomatic ties with Israel. Yet. It's coming. And between 67 and 70, Cuba actually sent military assistance to Egypt during the War of Attrition in order to help the takeover of the Sinai Peninsula. But the sources on this area of like history was like very US and Israel like kind of focused, which I thought was really interesting. Like the one gap of like pro like Palestine from Cuba is like the sources of this is like a little wonky. And then things changed in 1973, and this is from US government sources. Arab and non-aligned countries pressured Cuba to break relations with Israel in 1973 and sponsored the UN resolution on Zionism, quote unquote, as a form of racial discrimination. And this really stood out to me because it's kind of framing like the Cuban people's political decisions as like not their own. Like they can't decide for themselves to align themselves with like the Arab League and just like Arab countries who are anti-imperialist. They just seemingly can't decide to do that without help from the United States, because that's their parents and they must obey, right? No. So, you know, the people have the ability to free themselves, and the fact is that like this summit of non-aligned countries, they voted on breaking relations with Israel in 1973 through this summit. And, you know, US sources argued that they just wanted to lean in favor of Palestinians as a quid pro quo for helping the Castro government secure influence among third world nations. But in like the fine print of like the actual like summit documents, it's because they are in favor of like liberation and self-governance and sovereignty for nations that are facing imperialism, especially from the US and like European powers. And one line from it, from this document, from the summit says, it calls upon the non-aligned countries to pledge their support for the Arab people of Palestine, not Israel. Israel is very rarely mentioned in this document too. In their struggle against Zionist, racist, and colonial settlements for the recovery of their full national rights, emphasizes that the recovery of those rights is a fundamental prerequisite for a just and lasting peace, and declares its recognition of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people and of their just struggle. And so it's pretty like cut and dry, it's kind of common sense almost, that it's just like, this is how they see it, like reality in Palestine, and this is their stance, and they haven't moved from this stance since 73 essentially. They still do not have any diplomatic ties with Israel. So yeah, there's lots of official and non-official ties with the PLO during this time and the Cuban government, and today that's more I guess shows up with the PFLP and the DFLP, which is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front. So those still exist. And then briefly, just so I've been speaking back and forth with my grandfather. You know, he's like, it's like the one family member I have, essentially, like blood related, who is very like reciprocal to like my politics. So we've been connecting on that more and more. So I was like, what do you want to tell people about, you know, like Cuban solidarity of Palestine and how like this has always been a thing, right? And he's made a lot of art about it because he's a sculptor and a painter and all of that. So we didn't get a chance to project stuff, but if you want to see some of those things, you can just see me afterwards. But he said in his own words, directly translated from Spanish, yes, in our Cuba, not just Cuba, our Cuba, there is constant solidarity with Palestine. The United States does the same with Cuba, but covertly through the blockade. So I think that draws some pretty intense connections right there. And then we also talked a little bit back and forth about, because this was a week and a half ago, when Iran fired back and targeted Israel with defense drones and stuff. We talked about how that was the side effect, the consequence of the US and Israel thinking that they have power and that no one is ever going to oppose them, and that's not true. Like Syria has a right to defend itself, Iran, Iraq, Palestine, like they all have that right under international law. So for Israel to be surprised that they fired back is just doesn't make that much sense. And then the Cuban president, Diaz-Canel Bermudez, made a statement to the ICJ. There's also copies of this document by the back, but this was February of this year, in defense of Palestinians' right to defend themselves. He says a media campaign of lies and suppression is an important part of Washington's 62-year economic and political blockade of Cuba. Oh wait, no, this is about the UN votes that only Israel and the US are in favor of the blockade. Sorry. So Bermudez says on the current war in the Gaza Strip, our delegation appears before the solemn sitting as an expression of Cuba's genuine interest in and commitment to peace, and based on its historical and unconditional solidarity with the peoples that are subject to colonialism and foreign domination. And the genocide against the Palestinian people is not limited to the current stage of the extermination war being waged by Israel. All of this with the complicit attitude of the United States of America, which prevents the international community from acting to protect the Palestinian people. We also see a direct, effects of this through the encampment movement, and through uprisings in the U.S. and in just like pretty much every country that has people, and it's people who are aware of what's going on. They are rising up in the thousands and in the millions to stand with Palestine. So this has been an ongoing solidarity effort for decades. They've had multiple marches in Havana, which the president has been a part of, because this is a very like populist, like pro-people government, and like the president is a person just like everybody else, so he's marching with the people. This is back in November of last year. And there's one quote, we are here, and they're marching like through Old Havana. We are here is no coincidence that we have marched in front of the United States Embassy. So I just want to throw out all these bits about like the US's role too, because we have to remember that living where we live, and if we feel powerless, like the people who are in charge of everything are saying that they have like this power to, you know, like colonize and extract resources from any country that just doesn't do what they say, and it doesn't make sense to keep going with the minority of these two countries of Israel and the US to continue doing that, and that's not in favor of like the majority of people in Cuba or Palestine or just the world. And Marcy also touched on May Day. Final quote I'll leave off on just the experience. This is from an article in Telesur, which is a like global South based like Latin American perspective news site. Despite the triumph of freedom over servitude, which is in context with like the 1959 revolution, Cuban workers are not resting. Now they are fighting against a genocidal and rotten blockade, which delays and slows the development, quality of life, and economy of an entire people. And I think they are directly talking about Cuba and how, you know, they're suffering this blockade, but like without, you know, the descriptors for the countries, this can also easily be applied to Gaza and their economic blockade of the Gaza Strip, and how it's emphasized like through May Day and just like the politics of Cuba, that the workers are not just letting things happen to other workers and just other people of the world. They are saying like no to tyranny and to like control over our economies just because these other countries say that that's the way to protect democracy, and that doesn't make any sense, you know, by the rules of logic and science that we have here with organizing. So I will just leave it at that, and we have time for questions and answers to get into more of the fine lines. So thank you.
Thank you all for your presentations. To just launch our Q&A discussion, one thing that I've noticed through this conversation is there, both with Palestine and with Cuba, we see this label of like of terrorist or terrorism applied. And so I'm wondering if you all could speak a little bit more about, we see Cuba as a state is put on a state-sponsored terrorism list. And then we also see Palestinian resistance and liberation in the media here getting this label of terrorism and terrorists. So maybe we'll go in the same order of the panel. If Mariam, if you want to share some thoughts, and then thank you.
Yeah, this label of terrorism, I think everybody in this room knows, is used strategically to undermine, you know, resistance movements. Anybody who dares to challenge U.S. imperialism. So in the case of Palestine, I can speak about, for example, Hamas. Right, Hamas is designated as a terror organization in the U.S. Now, Hamas itself is a like political government. Right, they have a military wing called Qassam, and Qassam was designated as a terrorist organization. You know, standard because it's military and it carries out military operations. But Hamas is the people, like the representatives of the government, right? They are the people that you would sit at a table and negotiate with, right? Like if you want to negotiate hostage release, you would negotiate with Hamas leadership. But the reason the U.S. and other world powers want to designate Hamas as a terrorist leadership is because then they can use the card, we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? So it undermines the Palestinian ability to be able to come to the table and actually be able to talk about how do we get to a solution, how do we get to, you know, a resolution to this issue. And so that designation in of itself is a way to undermine Palestinian liberation movements. And Hamas was designated as a terror organization after Qassam. So again, on Qassam, like that kind of makes sense in the context of the way the US looks at things. But why would they designate Hamas? It's because Hamas was gaining popularity, because their military wing was achieving gains. And now they wanted to crush and cripple. And now the other really important implication of designating anybody as a terrorist is the financial implication of that. It's incredibly hard to send money to Palestine because of this notion that if you send it to Gaza specifically, that it would be going to terrorists. And so that's made it incredibly hard for people to send money to their families. Holy Land Foundation, prime example. It was shut down because they were they were somehow linked financially to terror organizations. We see individual accounts here in the US of people, accounts being shut down because of this notion that anything they send to Palestine could be connected to terrorism. So it's a very dangerous tactic. It's very effective in crippling any dissent or any opposition to imperialism.
So I'm gonna talk about just a campaign that's going on right now. So the state sponsors of terrorism list is basically a list that I think is Cuba, and I think it's Iran and Iraq, maybe? I don't even know. There's like 2 countries besides.
Iran and Syria.
Who was it?
Iran and Syria.
Oh, Iran and Syria, okay. And so Cuba's on this list, and it was put on by Trump because I think it's his way of getting back at Obama for increasing normalization of the US towards Cuba. And so it doesn't make any sense, and just like it doesn't make any sense probably in the other countries too. So but President Biden has continued the listing and doesn't see, and like I said, they said today they're not going to take Cuba off the list. And what it means is, for example, that I'm just going to read from this flyer, that companies worldwide that want to sell medicines or food to Cuba often can't because their own bank refuses to accept Cuba's payment under threat of enormous fines from the US Treasury for dealing with terrorists. And it's the thing that banks and other financial institutions cannot deal with countries or anybody that's called a terrorist. And so whatever that means. So anyway, I will maybe talk about this later, or should I talk about it
Later. Yeah, later. Thank you.
Is it okay if we keep going? I don't really have more to say.
Yeah.
Oh, question over. Did I just start taking hands then?
Yeah, go for
Okay.
it.
In the 1960s, there was a saying, the river in Egypt, or the river is not only, the Nile is not only a river in Egypt. Okay, the US has always been a democracy, and the US is the best propaganda money can buy. And that the US stands for democracy and human rights is a total farce. As we witness genocide in Gaza and the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, what does the US system do? They send more money or more military weapons to Israel as they continue to commit crimes against humanity in Gaza and the West Bank. What is wrong with the US system? I mean, there is no accountability, and there's no accountability for what the US does. I mean, what we need is a large, massive, strong anti-war movement. This peace movement's got to be self-disciplined, and we've got to take care of each other. It's like this system is so rotten that other countries around the world are invested with it. And again, when will peace and justice communities get tired of being, fools for the U.S. Democratic Party?
Thank you. Yeah. Do folks have any questions for our panelists?